Story 1. I just woke up to let the dishwasher installer into our house. He started saying that the United States had been attacked and that we were now all at war. My wife and I exchanged worried glances, thinking this man was a lunatic in our home. Then we turned on the television. I immediately called my best friend and told him to turn on his television. He asked, "What channel?" I replied, "It doesn't matter." Story 2. I skipped school and turned on the television to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but every channel was covering the first plane crash. Story 3. Being woken up by my girlfriend, now wife, calling me repeatedly on the phone to turn on the television was challenging, especially since I had worked the night shift. It is difficult to explain to young people how much the world changed that day. There was life before September 11th, 2001, and the life we have now. If you know, you know. Story 4. I was in New York, packing to fly to Dallas that day. The morning news reported that the World Trade Center was on fire. I watched for 10 minutes, then the second plane hit. Chaos ensued. Planes were grounded, and highways were closed. It was complete shock. When I finally got a flight 5 days later, there was still a plume of smoke rising from Ground Zero, which I saw from the Whitestone Bridge. Then came sadness, followed by fury. Story 5. I was 19. It was 6 a.m. on the West Coast. I was still living at home while attending community college, sound asleep. I was awakened by both of my parents yelling at the TV. Story 6. I was 18, just 3 days before my 19th birthday. I was still living at home and didn't have to go to work that day. I turned on the television right as the second plane hit. My brain didn't even process what was happening. I felt like I was watching a strange movie. I flipped the channel and saw the same thing, then another and another. I slowly realized the magnitude of what was happening and called my mom. My mom worked at the Sprint World headquarters, and nobody in her office area even knew what was happening yet. I'll never forget how she answered the phone with a fading laugh, presumably from joking with a colleague. Her voice changed dramatically as she said, "What?" after I told her that New York City was being attacked and that she needed to get to a television immediately. Dial-up was still the method of accessing the internet for the most part, so most web pages wouldn't load or would load very slowly due to increasing traffic. I became a liaison of sorts for my mom's work team. I called every 5 or 10 minutes only to say that the Pentagon was hit or that a plane crashed in Pennsylvania. These were truly otherworldly statements. Everything seemed to be getting worse. I felt sick, helpless, and lost. Definitely a day I always remember as if it were yesterday. Story 7. Walking into my office as the plane hit the tower, I worked for a firm headquartered in the North Tower, Marsh. When I got to work, a calendar alarm reminded me of my canceled trip to New York City scheduled for September 11th, 2001. Sadly, Marsh lost 295 individuals that terrible morning. I lived in Tulsa at the time, so I was really excited to be invited to New York City. Story 8. I eventually found out very late in the day. I was on a British Airways flight to John F. Kennedy International Airport at the time. We started orbiting just south of Greenland. The constant left turn, which I am quite sensitive to, indicated to me that we were on a descent about 10 to 15 minutes before most could tell. There was an announcement about navigational beacon problems, but I knew enough about the beacon systems then to understand it was not true. Eventually, we were diverted to Halifax, Nova Scotia. We landed and taxied. It felt strange at this point, but when we parked on the alternate runway and saw other flights next to us, things became even more unusual. After some time, we were deplaned, processed, and moved to reception centers around Halifax. It was only coming down the stairs from the aircraft that we began to understand what had happened. The Canadians were exceptional. The amount of support they provided was faultless and much appreciated. That first night, the fast food restaurants provided platters of food piled high, along with necessary services and entertainment. One of the most special and appreciated services was a room with a bank of phones, allowing me to finally call my wife and kids. This was a time before nearly universal mobile phone coverage, and those lines were a godsend. I love Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thank you so much. You are all amazing. Story 9. I was a senior in college walking through the Student Union building on my way to my first class of the day. I walked by a television with the news on and turned back around to go to my dorm room, where I watched both towers fall on live television. Story 10. It was a Tuesday. I started my shift at the YMCA doing morning care for the children. Parents would drop their kids off at the facility, and we would drive them to school once the schools opened. We had a television in the office. I witnessed the second plane hit. I called my girlfriend and told her to turn on the TV. After my shift, I went home, and my best friend called me in tears. It's all so terrible. Felt like a movie, and it still does. I turned on the news once I got home and saw that they had attacked the Pentagon. I took a nap in my parents' bed and thought that the world might be over when I woke up. I woke up, and the world wasn't over, but it was never the same again. Story 11. Walking into my fourth grade classroom while the teacher explained what was happening, we watched the first tower fall on our way to the auditorium because it was on television in the library. My class just happened to be walking by at that moment. That's when everything changed from confusion to fear, as most of the adults could not keep their emotions hidden. Honestly, I do not blame them. It is really unsettling, but ever since that day, I cry every time I hear the national anthem. My therapist says it's a manifestation of mild post-traumatic stress disorder from September 11th, but that most Americans old enough to form memories at the time have experienced something similar. Story 12. A friend called me at home and started screaming, asking where I was since I live in New York City and if I knew what happened. I turned on the television, and it was all over the news. There was confusion and disbelief. I walked to the corner to see all of downtown in smoke. The towers that used to be the only visible landmark for miles were gone. I lived on the west side where the towers were, and sirens were blaring everywhere, unrelenting. Story 13. I had just gotten off the Washington, D.C. Metro Red Line after transferring from the Blue Line, which goes right next to the Pentagon. Getting home was interesting that day. Story 14. Feeding my newborn and getting ready to take my 2-year-old to the park next to our train station. We lived in a big city, and the trains came from downtown nonstop, bringing people in. My son was giggling and so excited about the many trains. I held my newborn, watched my son in his joy, and just cried. Story 15. I was woken up by my mom. Yes, someone flew his plane into the World Trade Center. I went downstairs to watch another person fly his plane into the other World Trade Center building. Story 16. Sleeping. We lived in Hawaii in a different time zone. My dad, wake up, we're under attack. Honestly, not the best approach for a previously bombed island, but okay. Story 17. I was a freshman in high school in California. Some of our classes had televisions that were mainly used with a video cassette recorder or digital video disc player and didn't have cable. All the teachers had the televisions on the staticky basic channels with the news. We didn't do any school lessons that day. Everyone just watched, completely silent. We saw people jumping to their deaths and the second building get hit live in school. It was terrifying to realize it wasn't an accident when the second plane hit. I also remember not seeing planes fly above us all day and how strange that was because we were in the flight path for Los Angeles International Airport. It's a day I'll never forget. Now I'm 38, and my 8-year-old was born on September 11th. He came home from school this year in second grade to tell me he hates his birthday because it's a sad day, and they learn about sad things in school. I don't blame him. I really didn't want him to be born on that day, but I tried to explain how he has turned it into a happy day for anyone who knows him. Still, I wouldn't want that birthday either. Story 18. I dropped my son off at the babysitter and was getting ready to take the metro to work. As I was preparing, I saw and heard the television. I called from my job and drove to my son's school to pick him up. Story 19. I was in the shower when I heard the first explosion and felt the shock. I was sick and late for work, but if I had been on time, I would have been walking through the courtyard between the two towers instead of being in the shower when the first plane hit. I lost many people that day, including relatives and friends. I have lost others over the years. The mother of one victim died of cancer that was undoubtedly caused by stress. Many first responders and survivors have faced health issues as well. Nothing has ever been the same since that day. Story 20. It was around 11 p.m. in Melbourne, Australia. I was in bed reading when my son came in and said that something serious was happening in New York. I got up and turned the TV on. We were watching the live report from the United States at the moment the second plane hit. It was a horrible day. Story 21. I was working in the National Security Agency. I watched it live on TV like almost all other people. After the second plane hit, all our systems lit up. It was pure chaos. Ask me anything. Story 22. Playing the bassoon in middle school band in New York. Many students had parents who worked at the World Trade Center. Another teacher came in to deliver a message to send the students home. Story 23. I was in school, talking to my friends who visited there the day before on a school trip. I did not go because I dislike tall buildings and I had an irrational fear of what if they fell. Story 24. I had a second period lunch break in 9th grade, so I was hanging out with some people in front of my school having a smoke. Story 25. I was at home and had injured my back at work. My mother called me and told me we had been attacked. I thought she was referring to my parents personally. Story 26. Job hunting while listening to Howard Stern. He announced it had happened, so I turned on the TV to watch the news as I continued to listen. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, so as the news got worse, things became strange. My wife, who was living in California at the time, slept through the whole event. Story 27. I was walking up the stairs from the downtown 23 RD Street N/our station, located under the Flatiron building where I worked, and noticed a large crowd standing on the sidewalk. I immediately assumed there was a film shoot happening. There wasn't. I asked a colleague next to me what was going on, and he just looked downtown, where smoke was pouring out of one of the towers. Story 28. 8th grade. I thought I was seeing footage from an upcoming movie. Then the whole school went crazy. That's when I realized I had just witnessed a live terrorist attack. Story 29. I had just dropped my kids off at daycare and was listening to the morning radio, thinking they were doing one of those pranks on air. I changed the channel and the next station was talking about it too. I remember the exact spot on the road when it hit me that it was real. Story 30. I was in class in college in Europe. The class must have just finished when someone said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. My initial reaction was that this was a bad accident and that it had happened before. A bomber hit the Empire State Building during World War II. I found a television just in time to watch the second plane hit the other tower live. I think I said no, no, no as it was coming in, as if I was trying to will it away from the building. At that point, it was clearly an intentional act, but we didn't know who or why at that moment. I also watched both buildings collapse, which was both horrifying and incomprehensible. That night, a group of Holocaust survivors was scheduled to speak to my program, and some people wanted to cancel it, but the director held the event, believing it mattered more now than it did earlier in the day. He was correct. It is surreal to have an elderly Holocaust survivor apologize and tell you how sorry they are about what just happened to your country, especially since such a person knows exactly where an event like this can lead. Story 31. I was on the West Coast getting ready for work when my aunt called and told me to turn on the TV. She asked if I had heard from my sister in Washington, D.C. I frantically tried to reach her. When I got through, she said that she was safe and would talk to me more when she got home. By then, I had been driving to work. I tried to leave a message with my youngest sister through her high school. The receptionist said she could only take messages from parents. I asked if she could just pass on the message that her sister in Washington, D.C. was safe. Arriving at work, everyone was shocked. I worked for an institutional investor that traded bonds. We knew people in the World Trade Center buildings. Everyone just watched the news on the TVs around the floor. Since the markets were closed, we cleaned up for the day and waited to see what the market would decide to do the next day. My sister in Washington, D.C., said that she was in a meeting and could see smoke coming from the Pentagon. My acquaintances in New York City said it took forever to get back to their homes since the subway was shut down. Many spent hours getting to their children's daycares and schools. Others spent days sleeping in their offices because the commute would have been impossibly long with all the closures. I don't know how they managed to go back to work. Some did not make it home again. Our acquaintances at Cantor Fitzgerald were all lost. It has been a long time since September 11th, but it still affects me as it was the first major event in my adult life. When people make September 11th jokes, it will always be too soon for me. Story 32. I was asleep when my brother called and woke me up. He told me to turn on the TV. I asked what channel and he said any channel, so I did. Then I called the schools and informed them that my sons would not be coming in. The lady said she didn't blame me. After that, I went to the Internal Revenue Service building where my wife was working and told her to get in the car because we were leaving. She saw how serious I was and said she needed to clock out, as she hadn't heard anything yet. I insisted that she was not clocking out and was leaving with me immediately. I then informed her, in front of her coworkers who also hadn't heard yet, that planes had hit both Twin Towers and the Pentagon and that America was under attack. People looked at me suspiciously, so I told them to turn on the TV, any channel, and that my wife and I were leaving right away. We left. The world changed that day, and it has never gone back to the way it was. Story 33. In high school, the principal spoke over the loudspeaker after the first plane hit. We watched the news for the rest of the day, except during math class. Our math teacher insisted on teaching a lesson, which was very typical of her. Story 34. I was on a business trip to Melbourne. I woke up on the 12th, freshened up, and went down to the restaurant for breakfast. On each breakfast table was the daily newspaper. On the front cover was a photo of a plane hitting a tower. On the large television over the bar, the horrific scenes were being replayed. I received a frantic call from the administrator at the Melbourne office, telling me to check out and get to the airport, stating that she booked me a ticket back to Singapore. The taxi driver informed me about what I had missed. I still remember his name was Alex, and the taxi had been sprayed with lilac-scented air freshener that made me want to throw up. Story 35. I was sitting on my couch with my 9-month-old son watching the news. My older kids had already gone to school, but I really wanted to go and pick them up. Fortunately, I spoke with my sister who lived in New York City, and she was on one of the bridges. She turned around and went home. It felt like the end of something, and it was. Story 36. I was in a car service going to my first day at work in New York City. I splurged and took a car service, and 1010 Winds was playing on the radio. They kept saying a plane went into the building. Both the driver and I thought they meant a Cessna-type plane. They mentioned a passenger plane, but we still didn't understand. Then there was another hit, and even the newscaster thought a helicopter had gotten pulled in by the smoke. I arrived at the office, and everyone was in a panic. They dug an old television set out from under a desk and plugged it in. Everyone was upset because it was a social worker job, and we had clients in need that we had to attend to. My new coworkers got the information that we needed to get to the kids in the schools. I called my husband to check in and tell him to go across the street to pick up the kids from school, and he hadn't even woken up or turned on the television. He mentioned that my sister had just called. I called her back and still had no idea what was happening because we couldn't get a signal on the television. I called my sister, and she was panicking that a plane hit the building. By that point, I learned it was both towers, but I had no idea she was talking about actual airplanes. I actually laughed at her when she was worried about the damage and said, "Do you know how strong those towers are?" It was my first day at work, and I was using the office phone like that, which was a no-no, so I told her I had to go. Finally, they got the television working, and we saw what was happening. Story 37. I was in bed with my roommates after falling asleep the night before, watching Titanic on DVD. My ex-wife called and told me to tune in to the news right away. It was 8:58 a.m. Central Standard Time, and I tuned in to see a shot of the North Tower with a large smoking gash in its side. I had 5 minutes to process what I was witnessing before Flight 175 entered from the right of my 36-inch Toshiba screen and crashed into the South Tower in a massive fireball. I felt sick to my stomach. I realized that I had just witnessed the death of dozens of innocent people, and the first crash was no accident. A half hour later, I was at work. We spent the day glued to the television and ended up all going home at 3 p.m. People in America became closer to each other that day. However, for 23 and a half straight years since then, we have been driven further apart. Story 38. I was on a cruise ship out of Fort Lauderdale one morning. It was overwhelming because half the people on cruise ships from Florida were from New York or New Jersey. Cell phones didn't work in open water, and there was no Wi-Fi. It was a disaster. Story 39. I was 10, playing at home because I had no school that day, which was Teacher's Day in Argentina. My dad was listening to the radio, and they began talking about an incident in New York. So he turned on the TV. I will never forget that morning. Story 40. I had just made myself a bowl of cereal and turned on the television to watch some cartoons before I left for school. Instead, the news was on. I didn't eat that day. I will never forget the moment I saw the person jump from the building or when the second tower collapsed. Story 41. I was home with my family. I remember when we saw the news, and at first we thought it was some kind of disaster film. It was shocking to see that footage. Story 42. I am a 48-year-old man from the UK. I was on holiday in the United States at the time, scheduled to fly back to the UK on September 12, 2001. My friend and I were in Chicago for a few days of partying. We woke up on the 11th, hungover and looking forward to a lazy day of recovering and preparing for our journey home. It was a humbling experience to be among people of a different country going through such distress and upheaval. At that time in the UK, there was a reality and memory of the conflict in Northern Ireland and the distress it caused on both sides, so I have felt a kinship with the people of the United States since then. Story 43. I was at a bus stop in Paris. It was 3 days after it happened, and I overheard some Americans talking about it. I didn't speak French and hadn't been watching or listening to the news, so the news passed me by until that moment. Story 44. I was in 3rd grade. I remember going to class and my teacher crying when she turned on the television. We were all led out of the room to sit around the flagpole in front of the school until our parents were notified to pick us up. I don't think I have ever experienced silence like that. Story 45. I was celebrating my 25th birthday in Las Vegas when my boyfriend's mother called that morning and told him to turn on the television. I couldn't believe it. I sat in the hotel room shocked and numb. The hotel lobby was full of people trying to find a way to get home. I remember some even renting limousines because there weren't any rental cars left. We spent 2 days on a Greyhound bus back to Texas since the flights were grounded. First, we had to go to California, then turn around and head back towards Texas. The buses were packed, and people sat there in disbelief. It was so quiet, especially for a full bus. Story 46. I was in the United States Navy aboard an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Gulf on September 11th. My story tends to be unique compared to most. Story 47. In 1st grade, I saw my teachers speaking in hushed tones with worried faces. They moved us from our seats to the carpet afterwards. Story 48. I was woken from a deep sleep by Fort Lewis Base Operations, informing me that I needed to be at the Emergency Operations Center immediately, regardless of what I was wearing. I put on a physical training uniform. Story 49. I served in the Air Force. We were in Egypt for the Bright Star exercise, building a base in the middle of the desert. It wasn't operational yet, so we were headquartered at the Mina House, directly across the street from the Giza pyramids. As soon as the Pentagon was attacked, we went to DEFCON 2 with a communications blackout, and all military personnel were quickly moved to the underdeveloped base. Beyond knowing we were under attack, none of us knew what else was happening for the next 2 months. No internet, no phones, not even the Stars and Stripes newspaper. As far as we knew, World War III had started. The base became operational quickly, and missions were launched from our location. Story 50. I was 18, already graduated, and had stayed up very late the night before, so I was sleeping in. My mother's 40th birthday was the previous day, and she had taken the day off for an extra-long celebratory weekend. So she was sleeping in too. My best friend saw the news, called to tell me, and woke my mother up instead because the cordless phone was in her room. Mom flipped on the news and saw it, then came to get me. I was in a daze and had no idea what was happening. So I just sat down obediently at the end of her bed and stared blankly at the television for what seemed like an appropriate length of time. After a while, I got up and said I was going back to bed. Mom looked at me like I had just sprouted a second head and said, "Are you serious? This is history in the making." I sat back down again and resumed staring blankly. Suddenly, the news reporters began repeating, "They hit the Pentagon," which woke me up instantly. I was like, "Wait, what? What's going on?" Mom exclaimed, "Oh my God, are we under attack?" Shortly afterward, the towers fell. We saw it live. It was horrifying and strange. We both looked at each other strangely and said, "That looked like a demolition." The way they came straight down without touching any of the other buildings was just not what we would have expected at all. We lived near a major international airport, and I think it was later that afternoon when I went outside, stood looking up at the sky and listened for a long time. No planes, just silence and birds chirping. All flights had been grounded. I didn't know that everything would be different after that day. Story 51. I was at work at school near Washington, D.C. They had the news on in the library when they switched to a plane that had crashed into one of the towers. Many teenagers, including myself, watched the second plane hit. Soon after, there were discussions about a plane hitting the White House and another crashing into the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool near the Washington Monument. Finally, there was confirmed information about the Pentagon. Many students had parents who worked there, so the situation deteriorated quickly. Story 52. I was at home. My parents were watching the news while I was getting ready for school. Then I was sitting in my third grade classroom when our teacher told us about the terrorist attack. That's when I found out there was more than one plane. I remember a kid freaking out because his mom was on her way to New York City that morning. Story 53. I was in Army basic training on September 11th. I was on kitchen duty and saw it happen on TV. My drill sergeant allowed everyone with family in New York to call home to check in, except for me. I never found out why he hated me so much, but luckily my family was okay. I graduated basic training and tanker school a month later. The following year, I was in Iraq on my first deployment. Story 54. I was working in a state office. There were various rumors in the waiting room with about 50 clients. I had to explain everything we had heard on the news. There was a lot of confusion and crying. Story 55. Waking up, my alarm clock was set to National Public Radio, and I thought they were discussing the time a bomber crashed into the Empire State Building. It became clear that it was terrorism at the exact moment my philosophy professor was saying it's a terrible tragedy, but we should move on with our day. We found out after class. Story 56. I was getting ready to go swimming. I put my suit on just before the second plane hit, but I did not go swimming. That evening in Austin, Texas, was the only time I saw the television in the Texas Chili Parlor tuned to the news, with everyone watching it. Story 57. I walked into a classroom on campus at the University of Texas at Dallas, and the TVs were showing the fires. We all sat there in shock, talking until we were dismissed. I went back to my apartment and turned on the TV in the living room, calling my roommates to watch the news just as the towers collapsed. Story 58. I was standing in the commons of my high school after the first plane hit and watched the second one hit live. Story 59. Walking into one of my classes at high school, I listened to the Slayer CD my older brother got for me at a midnight sale the night before, titled God Hates Us All. Story 60. I got in the car after dropping my kids off at daycare. I was a journalist at the time, so my days, weeks, and months became quite busy. Story 61. I just arrived at my hotel room in Taipei after a nice dinner with our hosts. I was on official government travel. They didn't edit the footage there, and we saw all the people who jumped. It was frankly terrifying. The next few days were quite difficult. Story 62. While watching a late-night talk show called Rove in Australia, they stopped mid-show and cut straight to the news, which was on every single channel. Story 63. Checking email. We had just come in from having coffee on the patio. It was such a beautiful day. I sat down to check my email. My mother-in-law liked to send us emails anytime a plane crashed anywhere because we were in the Air Force. I nudged my husband to turn on the news. Mom says a plane crashed. 15 minutes later, He was already on his way to the base as the second tower fell. That was a really difficult day. Story 64. I was in 10th grade during my third period math class. In the last few minutes of class, a hall monitor stepped in to say something. It seemed like the teacher tried to shush her for fear of upsetting the class, as many parents worked in New York City. Minutes later, we moved on to our next class, English, where our teacher talked candidly about the incident. The rest of the school day went as scheduled, but all after-school events were canceled, and many students were left wondering if their parents in New York City were okay until the evening. It was a bizarre day. Story 65. I was taking a nap when my grandma woke me up to watch television. We watched from the exact moment the second plane hit until both towers fell. I remember I played with my toys and drew the towers in flames for months. Don't judge me. I thought it was just a movie at that time. Story 66. I had just started a month before at the company. We had an all-hands meeting. Our vice president interrupted the meeting to announce that an airplane had crashed into a building in the United States and that a few managers needed to return to the office for various reasons since we work in the aviation industry. Not long after that, he returned and informed us that there was another collision, and they suspected it was deliberate. He then canceled the rest of the meeting, and everyone returned to the office. Some did not stay long. They just went home. Those of us who stayed behind did not work much that day. I recall that the news website was stripped down to just a text page because it was receiving so many requests that it crashed, and they simplified it to ensure more people could access the information. We had a television in our eating area, and it was full of people watching the news feed. Story 67. We lived in the western United States, so it was still early morning for me. I had just gotten out of the shower and was getting ready for the day when my spouse knocked on the bathroom door and told me to get upstairs. I quickly finished dressing and got to the television just in time to see the plane hit the second tower. Live. A bit later, the first tower collapsed while I was commuting to work. We had television and computer monitors around our small company offices, and once I arrived, everyone was gathered around them. We all witnessed the second tower come down in real time as well. It was eerie. We didn't know if there was anything else coming, and people everywhere had no idea what to do or expect. Were we being invaded? Was this the start of World War III? Were we going to be in some strange Red Dawn scenario? We were terrified and had absolutely no answers. As the day progressed, the shock began to subside, and it became clear that it was over, at least for the moment. But we still had no idea what might come in the next hours and days. After witnessing all that, early in the afternoon, one of the employees grabbed our United States flag. Since we were all military veterans and had one we hung outside our door on holidays, and put it on display in the holder. It was clear we were attacked, and we didn't know if there was anything more to come. But we knew that America was in danger. After that, we displayed our flag every day for several months, as did many of our neighbors. Story 68. I was in kindergarten when my mom turned on the TV. I saw a replay of the first plane hitting the tower, and I thought it was a movie. I walked past and went on my way, not thinking too much about it until I saw the news again when I was older. I don't live in the United States, so news about it faded more quickly than what I remember. Story 69. Dusting the end tables, my husband called from work to tell me to turn on the TV. He was supposed to fly into New York City later, arriving around 1:30 p.m. for business, but that obviously didn't happen. I did see the second flight crash. It was a horrible day, especially for those who were directly or closely affected. Story 70. A group of us were in our warehouse loading the trucks for the day. The boss came out and gave me cash, instructing me to buy a television. We all sat in the warehouse and watched. Story 71. Probably asleep in a crib, crawling around the house, I was almost 9 months old. I am glad I was so young that I did not realize what was happening. If I heard about a similar situation now as an adult, I would be mortified and extremely sad. Story 72. I was working as a graveyard shift alarm dispatcher on the West Coast. Every morning, one particular company, an adult store, would call in for an early opening. What was normally a quick call, because we knew the guy's voice and could pull up the account without thinking, took a turn when they suddenly asked if we had heard the news. Then they just said we needed to turn on a TV. The way he emphasized need was so serious that I went straight to the break room, flipped on a small TV, and saw the devastation. Story 73. Sitting in an elementary school classroom, I remember the teacher rolling the television cart to the front of the room while we all waited to be picked up by our parents. Story 74. On my way to work at the airport, I will never forget the moment I arrived and everything was shut down. Story 75. I was sleeping, and when I got up and saw what was happening, I called in sick. I worked at the post office, and the news reported that those locations were also targets. Story 76. I was in 8th grade social studies class. The teacher told us what happened and then turned on the radio, and we listened to Dan Rather provide live play-by-play coverage of the towers collapsing. Story 77. Watching the morning news on TV here in Sydney, Australia, was a big shock to see the impact as both towers fell. Story 78. I was driving in my car, listening to the radio. The disc jockey kept talking about a plane accident, and when the second plane hit, it dawned on him that something serious was happening. I went home and watched the television, seeing both towers collapse live. Story 79. Ironically, I was in my 8th grade social studies class. Mrs. Nelson left the room for a bit, returned and said, "Our country is under attack." Story 80. I was driving to work when I heard on the radio about the first plane. When I got into the office, I assumed it was an accident and asked if anyone else had heard about it. Everyone was watching it on a computer and informed me that a second plane had hit. We didn't get any work done that day. We just watched news reports. Story 81. I was 11 years old in middle school in Dearborn, Michigan. The fear there was palpable, as if all the teachers and even the principal, most of whom were from the Middle East, knew what was about to happen next. It was overwhelming, and the television was only turned on in one classroom I was in for about 30 seconds. I had to wait until I got home to learn more about it. Story 82. I was at home waiting for the oil burner technician to clean my furnace. The news showed the first tower on fire, and as I watched, the second plane flew into the second tower. I continued to watch as both towers fell to the ground. Story 83. I went to work and turned on the radio, which had just started. Here's the strange part. I was traveling for my job in Connecticut. I completed my work the Friday before and still had the weekend before I flew home. I was bored on Saturday and decided to change my flight from Monday to Sunday. If I hadn't changed that flight, I would have been flying out of Boston at 8 a.m. with a stop in Newark, then on to Cincinnati. That was way too close. I'm not sure if I would have been on one of those flights, but it could have been my plane. That's unsettling. Story 84. I was in the snack bar at college between classes. They had televisions out and turned on, showing the news footage. Story 85. I woke up to the news that planes had hit the towers. I thought it was some sick joke. My parents were already at work on the West Coast. I turned on the TV and watched the first tower fall, alone at the age of 12. I didn't go to school that day. My dad came to pick me up, took me to McDonald's, and explained that we were under attack. That day, a majority of Americans lost their innocence and naivety. Story 86. I had Sky News playing in the background, so I kept watching everything unfold here in the UK. I had just returned from a part-time college course that day. I made a pot noodle and settled on the couch when the first plane crashed. My mother came back from work that evening, excitedly talking about it as if I didn't already know. She heard it on the shop radio and had fewer details than I did, but she was already wildly speculating. I pointed to the TV screen and she fell silent. Story 87. I was a junior in high school, sitting outside the weight room, waiting for the first period of weightlifting to start. A senior in the same class pulled up, intently listening to his radio, before I saw him burst out laughing. He got out, and when I asked what was so funny, he said someone just flew his plane into the World Trade Center. We then went into the weight room and worked out. Afterwards, I headed to my second period government class, just in time to see the second plane hit. Story 88. I was 19, lived in South Central Pennsylvania, and had worked a late shift as the manager of a Hollywood video the night before. My sister called me and woke me up around 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, just in time to turn on the television and see the second plane hit. It was a wild day that turned into a wild couple of decades. Story 89. I had just come home from picking up the newspapers off the front porch of the bookstore where I was working. I sat down in my home office to do some writing when the local news anchor on the radio mentioned the first plane, describing it as if it were a small aircraft. I went into the living room, turned on the television, and watched history unfold. Story 90. It was about 6:15 in the morning. I was getting ready for school, 7th grade, with my older sister, 11th grade, and our mom was getting ready for work when my dad called and told us that we needed to stay home and that my mom should not go to work because we were under attack. He told us to turn on the television and watch the news because a plane deliberately crashed into the World Trade Center. That's when we saw the South Tower on fire, and then, out of nowhere, the second plane hit the second tower. We just stood there in disbelief and confusion. Story 91. I was a sophomore in high school when I woke up to the radio reporting that the Pentagon was on fire. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to school. My first 2 classes were in the gym building, where there was no television. In third period, which was geometry, the TV was on, and there were reports of the towers being hit by planes. I asked the student next to me what was happening, and he said that planes had hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. We had a junior varsity football game scheduled against a high school in the state capital, but it was postponed since no one was sure what was really happening. Story 92. I was broadcasting my morning talk show while giving updates on the TV coverage. Story 93. I woke up for a job interview, and my roommates were glued to the television. I walked into the living room, and one of my roommates looked at me and said, "This is insane. The whole world is going to change." Boy, was he right. Story 94. I was trying to watch Dragon Ball Z, but the news was on every channel. It was very frustrating for a 9-year-old boy. Story 95. Waking up and lying in bed in Edmonds, Washington, I listened to my morning comedy radio show, which was surprisingly serious. I sensed something was wrong and checked the television just before the first tower fell. I was in disbelief and felt very sad. Story 96. I was at home alone, 10 years old and relaxing. I was homeschooled and lived in the country. My mom called from where she worked, asking me to turn on the TV. I inquired about which channel to tune into, but she said it didn't matter. I watched the towers fall alone in silence. Everything felt too quiet and disturbing. I was old enough to understand that this was not good, and I started feeling nervous being alone. It was eerie, and I sensed that things were going to be different. I ended up walking down the road to where my mom worked and let myself in. I visited often, and we had a good relationship. She was finishing her job, so I waited with the people she worked with until we could go back home together. I don't remember anyone saying a word as we watched the news. There was no panic, just stunned silence. It was an unsettling calm and quiet. It breaks my heart. I work with teenagers who weren't even born when it happened. A coworker and I were discussing this, and it struck us that those kids have no idea what life was like before the war. Things felt so different back then, and it's as if a switch had flipped. It really hit me that I was the adult now. Story 97. I was in the car when my mother decided to take my brother and me out of school early that day and bring us home. Story 98. Walking out of the gym, I was carrying my toddler and holding my preschooler's hand. It was on the televisions in the lobby. Story 99. I heard about the first plane on my way to work. I walked into the office and they were watching the news. Just then, the second plane hit. I had to make deliveries that day, so I listened to the coverage on the radio. It was a chaotic day. Story 100. My wife and I were probably among the last people on the eastern seaboard to find out. We had spent a week in Washington, D.C., on vacation, then drove down to see her parents in southwest North Carolina and stayed overnight. The next morning, we packed up and headed out. My wife saw one of her parents' neighbors come to their door as we were going down the street. The woman looked very distraught. We headed west to go through the Smoky Mountains. I made a wrong turn and got us lost on the back roads for most of an hour. We finally figured it out after puzzling over the map and decided to stop at a small convenience store to use the bathroom before heading over the mountains. Everyone in the store was watching the views of the dust cloud after the second collapse. We stayed watching for about 15 minutes, then got back in the car to head over the mountains and on to her brother's house in Alabama. Story 101. Born in 1995, I was on my way to school that morning when I heard about it on the radio in my mom's car. Later, all the teachers asked us if we knew what had happened. Story 102. I woke up after it was all over, turned on my computer, and saw a headline stating that hijacked airliners crashed into the World Trade Center, destroying the towers. My reaction was that the webpage had been hacked and this was a scare prank. Story 103. I worked for a cable television company in the United Kingdom, and there were televisions all over the office to ensure channels were live and working 24/7. It was mainly a billing and faults department. All televisions were switched to the news after the first plane hit. People were still working and watching when the whole office saw the second plane hit. Everyone stopped working and a silence came over the room. The manager at the time was a complete egotist whom everyone disliked. He came out of his office to see what the silence was about and berated everyone for stopping work over something in the news. We were told to switch off the televisions and get back to work. The whole office just shook their heads in disbelief. The next day, after realizing the gravity of what everyone was watching, he made a speech saying we would hold a minute's silence and turned it into an ego-inflated moment about how we all stand together in times like this. Such a narcissistic individual that even his own brother, who worked as a call agent, said he hated him. Seeing it live on the news was chaotic, especially since I had visited New York a couple of years prior, spending most of a day at the World Trade Center, including going to the top. My brother was particularly shaken by it, as he was much younger than I and was on the same trip. It's also the only time I've seen the news played on big screens in all the local pubs here. I went to one on the evening of September 11th, and there were crowds of people drinking and watching all the updates. Story 104. I was in the car with my dad. He was dropping me off at school a little late because I had a follow-up doctor appointment that morning. We were driving when the news first came over the radio, and he remarked, "Oh, bless their hearts, what a mess." Because I think most people where I lived immediately assumed it was an accidental plane crash, not something purposeful. I got dropped off, gave my note to the dean's assistant, and headed to class. I mentioned to a friend that I had heard about a plane crashing in New York City, although I had no frame of reference at the time. By the time we were in third period, all the teachers had it on the classroom television. We just watched it unfold. At noon, they sent us home in an emergency early dismissal. The school wanted parents to be able to talk to their children about this, rather than have kids come home scared and full of questions. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.